Greetings everyone, welcome down to the shop. On this episode of Prop Live, I'm Brittany Duran, and today I'm going to start digging through some of our old resin kits that we've had piling up in our shop. For those who don't know, it's really popular to do kit trading when you make stuff. So if you make a mold, make a resin kit of your prop, other prop makers will approach you and say, hey, that looks really cool. I would like one. I have a kit as well. Would you like to trade? And this sounds really cool on the surface, but what happens is you guys trade your kits and then you don't have time to finish them because you're all so busy. So we have, I didn't count, but we probably have about 20 different kits from different prop makers, and they're all really awesome, and I've been wanting to work on them. So today I'm going to take two of them and show you how to clean up kits and get them ready for paint. This is a kit we got from Sorenzo Props. It's the red hood. And before I paint it, I want to make sure to clean up all of the inside parts, take out the eye holes, and also clean up the seam in the back. The next thing I have is an old kit I got from Henchmen Props. Now I think this is one of the first pulls Jordan did from his Reaper gun. It's got some seams I need cleaning up and a couple bubbles, so I'll show you guys how to clean up all those little bits on this guy. So with this helmet, it was done in a slush cast, which means that there was a mold with an open void here. You pour in resin and you slush it around, and then once it starts curing, you pour in more resin and slush it around, and you try and get an even coating. Now it's actually pretty hard to get the technique down, especially with a new mold. I can tell this one, Tom got a lot of practice in slush casting because it feels perfectly even on the inside and it's pretty heavy. Sometimes when you buy a kit, they put fiberglass inside of it and then add more resin on top of it. This one I think is just pure resin. That's something you want to be aware of before you start drilling in your helmet, whether it has fiberglass embedded in it or not, because fiberglass, once you turn it into dust, you want to make sure to not breathe it or get it anywhere on your stuff. So if you have a good slush cast, there will be a ragged edge around the outside of the kit, and that's called flashing. With this guy, I'm going to be removing all of the flashing all the way up to pretty much the edge because it's a really thin helmet, and right now it doesn't even fit on my head. I have a pretty tiny head. First, I'll be removing all of this edging, and then I'm going to show you how to clean out the eye holes so I can actually see through it. It looks like Sorenzo Props did a couple layers of slush casting. You can see the resin has different colors in it. He probably used a resin that cures white like Smooth Cast's 65D, and then he added some tint to each layer. And since he added the tint separately to each layer, you can see that there's different tints going on. So he added a little bit less in this layer, a little bit more in the other one. If this was a mask, you could get away with this being a one-part mold without any seams on it. But because this is a helmet that tucks in a bit, if Sorenzo Props left this as a one-part mold, he would have to peel the mold inside out to get the casting out, and that puts a lot of stress on the mold. It can shorten its lifespan. So if you look here, you can see that there is a tiny seam going up the back. Stops right here, this guy. He probably covered the master in silicone and then cut this seam out with an X-Acto knife, probably at a jagged angle, with something like this guy. You take your X-Acto knife and bend it. Usually have to heat it up a bit with a blowtorch or something so you can bend it, and cut a jagged seam in the back of your silicone. And that way you have a nice registration for the silicone to go back together. This is super clean, like I could just sand that down. It is a little bit dented right here, so I'll have to fill that in, but that's super tiny. So far this is a really easy kit. The first thing I'll do is clean out all of this flashing though. I'm going to take it all the way up to the edge, and since the kit was slushed this far, this is going to be super thick. Before you go and clean up your kit, you want to make sure that all the areas are thick enough if it's a slush cast. I can tell just by the weight of this that it's probably fine. Also, you can kind of try and bend the edges. If they don't bend at all, then it's a nice thick layer. It might be a little thinner if it has fiberglass in it. Just make sure that it seems structurally sound. One of the tricks you can do is put a light behind it and see if you can see any light through the thin areas. So the part you're seeing there is the inside of the eye. Has that eye tear duct area and then the rim of the eye. And The eye area is the part I'm going to be cutting out, but I want to stay away from the inner eye. I don't want to cut that away. But you can see that's a thin spot. I'm shining a light from the back of the helmet, and you can see there's not any other light shining through, just on those thin areas. And also it's just one of the eyes that is a little thinner than the other. The other eye you can't really see through. So this is the part I'm going to cut out, but I want to make sure to stay away from this inner part here. This is the one that we were looking at from the inside of the helmet. It's a little bit thinner. It's really hard to get a completely even coating when you're slush casting, so that's why that one looks a little thinner. Since these are small eyes, I probably am not going to cut through the front. One of the favorite ways I like to remove material for eyes of kits, I like to use a sanding drum bit on my rotary tool. I'm going to want to stay away from this part here, but I'm going to take this bit and sand away just the eye and really focus on the edges. Eventually this piece of plastic is just going to fall out. I've decided for this edge I want to cut away pretty much the whole thing so that it will fit a wider head. I'm going to first use this cutting wheel on my rotary tool to cut away a strip of the resin, and then I'm going to switch to a sanding drum. That way I'm not going to generate as much dust because I'm going to cut away a lot of this material. You can just sand this away. You just want to make sure you have a kind of vacuum set up so that it will suck away all the resin dust. When I use the rotary tool, I like to wear my face shield. That way, if there's any kind of flying bits, that it won't go into my face. This guy has a chance to break pretty easily. It's really thin, so if you set this down hard, it can crack it or have it fall apart. These discs come in pretty big packs, so that gives you a clue as to how quickly you can break these and go through them. Also, they slowly wear down, so this disc is going to get smaller as I cut around this guy. Ah, it broke! No! That guy. So the problem with this is it's super thick right here. It's like almost like a 1/4 inch. So if I am not cutting straight down, the disc is in there, and I bend it a little, it's just gonna snap like that. These things are super brittle. You can just break them like that. But they cut really well. Like look at this guy. Look at how thick that is, and it just cut right off. I got the disc replaced on here, and now I'm going to cut away this huge chunk of resin, and oh, there we go, never mind. It just breaks off. You can see how thick that was there. In some of the spots, this resin was super thick. I probably shouldn't have been trying to cut it with a disc. The thicker the piece, more of a chance of the disc breaking if you have it at an angle. I got a strip of the resin cut away, so now I'm going to go through with a sanding drum and just smooth out the edges. I've got my dust mask to protect me from the resin dust, but I'm also wearing my face shield. That went pretty fast because I didn't have to remove too much material since I had cut it all away. I still need to clean up a little bit more of the edges. Yeah! I can't see anything! I'm going to be cutting out the eyes, and I'm going to do that from the back on the inside. I've got the eyes cut out, but there is still a little bit of a jaggediness around them. I can keep going with the sanding drum and sand away even more material, but I'm afraid I'm going to go too far, so instead I'm just going to trim out the rest with an X-Acto knife. Like that. This is a sanding twig. They usually come in a variety pack of all different kinds of grits, and they work great for working in tiny little areas. So I have a little bit of a jagged spot I don't want to cut away with an X-Acto knife, so I can go in with a sanding twig and just sand that guy down. I've got the eye holes all trimmed and cut out. The mouth isn't supposed to have a hole in it, but if you have a kit that does have a mouth opening, you can totally do the same process where you just sand the ridge where the mouth is from the back until you get a gap there. Yeah! The last thing I have to do for this guy is clean up the back seam, which is really faint. It's not going to take very much. I'm just going to knock this down with some 220 sandpaper. You can use a body filler if you want to fill in this little gap here, but we like to use super glue mixed with baby powder. For small fixes like this, it's a great way to fill in a gap really quickly. And the more baby powder you add, the more it will act like a paste. So it's really up to you the kind of mixture you want to make. It's got a cat hair in it for extra strength. Cool. This helmet is super smooth, but I'm going to be spraying primer on it and then wet sanding the primer down and then spraying it with a red paint and then a black paint around the eyes. So what I want to do is lightly rough up the whole surface to make sure the primer has something to grab onto. For that, I'm going to be using a sanding sponge and maybe some of this 400 grit sandpaper. So this guy's going to get some gray primer, and then I'll paint the whole thing with a red paint and then mask off these domino eye areas, and then those will get painted black. And that's pretty much it. I'll add some white mesh to the inside of the eyes so I can still see through them. And then I'll add some upholstery foam to the inside of the helmet so that it fits snug and doesn't slide around. And that's it for this guy. The next kit I'm going to be cleaning up is this Reaper gun from Henchmen Props. The interesting thing about this kit is it was done in a two-part mold, but I don't see a sprue where the resin was poured into. This guy here has a sprue on the top of it. That is the pouring spout. It's where the resin gets poured into to fill up the mold, and that gets chopped off later, and I don't see one on this gun. So the way that Henchmen Props probably cast this was he had the two-part mold open, brushed in some of the resin, and as that was curing, he probably poured in more resin, closed up the two-part mold, and then slush cast it. Because this gun is hollow, it makes it super light. So instead of having this out of a solid resin, I can actually hold it with one hand, and it's fairly light. It looks like the first layer that he brushed in was a dark colored resin, so it was either onyx or like a smooth cast 300 with a lot of the black tint in it. And then the resin that he poured in the rest had less tint. You can see on the seam line there is a lighter gray, and that's from the resin he poured in after he clamped up the mold and slushed it around. It really is a beautiful kit, but on some of the seams they're a little bit off. So when it got sandwiched together and slush cast, some of the registration was off, so there is a gap in the seam there that I'll have to fill in. When you have a two-part mold, you get a little bit of resin that seeps out of the seam, and that's called flashing, and you'll want to cut that away. I'm going to sand the flashing down on the seam here and then probably mark with a Sharpie the areas where I'm going to have to add material. I could just sand down this seam so it matches this little lip here, but since it is hollow, I don't want to make thin areas. So instead I think I'm going to add the material back up in some of the spots. Look at this, he has the text on here, model number. That's really cool. Got all this fun detail. You can see some areas here that look like they might be bubbles. This is just the different colors of resin that were slushed up onto the seam when the mold got closed up. To make sure they're not bubbles, you can take any kind of tool where you can put pressure on them and just lightly press on the spots, and if they break through, that means that it was indeed air trapped in the resin. It's solid resin, it's just different colors of tint that were put in there. If you see a protruding bubble, that's one that was caught in the mold inside the master, and those you can just knock off with any kind of, I'm just using a needle file. You can just knock those away. There's a teeny little bubble there. I like to widen the bubbles a little bit with a needle file and then make sure I fill them all the way with some of the super glue baby powder mixture. As I'm going around the seam of this gun, cleaning it up, I'm finding that I'm really liking using a flat file. I just scrape down the edge of the seam and try and break off as much flashing as possible, and then sand down the rest of the seam. This is nice because I can get into the sharp angles. I have a bubble right here that I want to fill, so I like to take a round needle file and soften all the edges. The goal is to make sure that the entire void gets filled, whether you're using body filler, epoxy sculpt, or the super glue method. You want to make sure you don't just cover the top of it, because then the void still exists and it might break away again. And you want to rough up the inside of it too, so whatever you fill it with won't want to pop out. I'm going to mix in quite a bit of the baby powder because I want this to be more like a paste. There we go, that looks great. I've got the seam pretty much sanded down, but there's this one spot down here on the grip. It's a little lower on one side than the other, and if this was a solid resin casting, I would just sand down the raised up bit until they were flush, but I don't want to make this any thinner, especially since this is probably one of the more high impact spots on the kit. So instead I'm going to be using a body filler to fill up the lower side. We like to use Evercoat. It sands a lot better and doesn't get as many voids in it when you're working with it than normal Bondo. When you're working with any kind of body filler, make sure you wear a respirator and work in a well-ventilated area. If we're working with large volumes of this stuff, we like to work outside. This is the paste that makes the body filler cure. And I didn't really need that much, but it's hard to just mix a tiny amount of this stuff. So this is going to cure really quickly. So I have to mix it and put it on there before it starts hardening. While it's curing, you can knock it down a bit, just to make your life easier with sanding, but this I'm just going to leave. It's pretty low profile. I am sanding down the whole surface with a rough sanding sponge and then going back over it with it's an older sanding sponge that's it acts more like buffing. So I'll knock down any of the rough surfaces with this guy, and then I'll go back over it with this. There are a couple more bubbles I want to fill. I found a little one right there. And yeah, there's just a little one right there. There's really hardly any. You'll usually find them in clusters. And this one, there's just a teeny little bubble here or there. So this is a really clean casting. If you do find a large group of bubbles, instead of poking them all individually and trying to clean them out, it's usually best gut the whole area with a rotary tool, just cut out the whole thing, and then fill that in with any kind of filler. I'm going to use some pretty aggressive sandpaper on a sanding block to knock down this body filler, and then when I get close to the shape I want, I'll switch to a much finer grit. And there we go. The seam is gone. This guy is just about ready to get some primer put on. Once it's sprayed with primer, I'll be able to see any of the little imperfections that I've missed. This kit did come with some extra pieces, but I'm going to leave them separate as I start painting it. Like this piece of the kit goes up here, and if I put this on now, then I'm not going to be able to paint under it very easily. With any kind of sprues, you'll want to cut them off or sand them away. This one has a giant opening on the top here that needs to be sanded down. Right before painting, I'll put a screw into one of these barrels, and that's where I'll hang it from so that I don't have to worry about putting a wire through the handle. I can put a clamp onto the screw and hang it from that. And now my kits are ready for primer. The primer that we like to use it's the Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch, the flat gray primer. It depends on the area you're working on as to what primer works best for you. I hear that the Rust-Oleum primer gives a lot of people problems who are in really humid areas. So if you're in Florida, you might have some problems with this curing, but up in Seattle, this stuff works great. After I spray these guys with a primer, it will highlight any imperfections that I missed, and I can go back in and fill more stuff and sand it and then prime it again. And that's pretty much the whole process. Just sand, prime, and sand some more. And once you get a good finish that you like, then you can move on to the final paint. Thanks for following along as I finish these two kits. I look forward to painting them, and this guy I might paint on a future live stream, so make sure to follow us over on twitch.tv/punishprops. Also, we have a couple other videos on our channel where we paint kits, so make sure to go check those out. I'll link them down below. See you guys on the next live stream.